Admiral Kim Jae-wook pressed his face against the cold bridge window, watching his worst nightmare unfold in the darkness of space. The enemy ships looked like floating glass cathedrals, beautiful and deadly, each one 3 times the size of his biggest warship. They moved through space with the grace of predators, tearing apart everything humans had built around Kepler 442b. The mining colony had been humanity's pride just 6 hours ago. Now the orbital stations were nothing but glowing debris, spinning, slowly as they died. Kim watched a defense platform explode in silence, its crew of 40 good people vaporized in an instant. He'd known some of them personally. Lieutenant Park from the Academy. Chief Engineer Yoon, who always fixed things with a smile. Behind him, the bridge hummed with desperate activity. Officers called out damage reports that got worse by the minute. The main display showed their fleet positions, 12 green dots, surrounded by an ocean of hostile red. It looked like a child's drawing of a massacre. Commander Park Se-jin approached with heavy steps, his face grim as death. "Sir, we're getting retreat orders from every Allied fleet." His voice cracked slightly. "The Veltar hive mind has run the calculations. They say we have 0.03% chance of survival if we stay." Kim nodded, but didn't look away from the window. He'd expected this. The Veltar were good allies, but they thought like computers when it came to war. Numbers didn't lie to them. When the math said die, they left. "What about the Corathans?" Kim asked, though he already knew the answer. "Already jumping to hyperspace, sir. Their crystal ships are gone." Park paused, then added more quietly, "Even the Xenari are leaving." Captain Velandra sent personal regrets, but their council voted for immediate withdrawal. That one hurt. The Xenari had been humanity's first real friends among the stars. Their warriors had fought beside human marines on 6 different worlds, but friendship had limits when facing certain death. Kim finally turned from the window to face his crew. 23 men and women who'd followed him across the galaxy, who trusted his judgment even when it defied all logic. Navigation Officer Lee Min-seo was barely 25, fresh from the academy, with dreams of exploring new worlds. Communications Lieutenant Han So-young had 3 kids back on Earth who called her their hero. Chief Engineer Choi Hyun-woo could fix anything with spare parts and prayer. They were all going to die here unless he gave the retreat order. The tactical display updated again. 300 Dominion warships now formed a perfect sphere around the human fleet. Their weapons could glass planets. Their shields could stop nuclear weapons. Their crews had conquered 47 star systems without losing a single battle. Kim's ships had kinetic cannons that shot metal slugs, plasma bursters that overheated after 6 shots, and hull armor made from processed asteroid ore. On paper, it wasn't even a fair fight. It was execution. But Kim's scanner showed something else. 3,000 life signs on the planet below, huddled in underground shelters that wouldn't protect them from orbital bombardment. Men, women, children who'd left Earth to build new lives among the stars. They'd trusted humanity to keep them safe. The communication panel lit up with incoming messages. Fleet Command was screaming for immediate withdrawal. The Coalition Council demanded he preserve his ships for future battles. Even the colony governor was begging him to save his crews rather than attempt an impossible rescue. Lieutenant Han So-young looked up from her station, her face pale. "Sir, I'm receiving direct orders from Admiral Thompson. All Terran forces are to withdraw immediately. He's making it a direct command, sir." Kim walked slowly to his command chair, each step feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His officers watched him with desperate hope, waiting for the order that would save their lives. The smart choice. The logical choice. The choice every other species in the galaxy would make. He sat down and opened the fleet-wide communication channel. 23 voices on his bridge fell silent. Across space, the crews of 11 other ships waited for his words. Kim thought about the children in those underground shelters. Some were probably crying, scared by the explosions they could feel through the rock. Others might be playing games, trusting that the grown-ups would keep them safe. Their parents had brought them here believing in humanity's promise to protect its own. "All ships, this is Admiral Kim," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We hold the line." Lieutenant Han's hands trembled as she closed the channel to fleet. Command without transmitting their surrender. Around the bridge, his officers straightened their shoulders and returned to their stations with grim determination. Outside the window, the Dominion fleet began moving closer, confident in their certain victory. They'd studied human tactics and found them chaotic. They'd analyzed human psychology and deemed it irrational. They had no idea what they were about to face. Overlord Vexthar floated in his command sphere, tentacles wrapped around holographic displays that showed the battle unfolding below. His species had conquered the galaxy through perfect mathematical precision. Every battle followed the same pattern: overwhelming force, enemy retreat, swift victory. It was clean. It was logical. It was how civilized warfare worked, but these humans were breaking every rule he understood about combat. His tactical computers had calculated the outcome before the first shot was fired. 12 primitive vessels against 300 advanced warships. The probability matrices were crystal clear. The humans should have surrendered immediately, or at worst, fought for exactly 17 minutes before recognizing the futility and retreating to preserve their forces for future battles. That was 43 minutes ago, and the humans were still shooting. Vexthar watched his displays with growing unease as human ships continued their attacks, despite taking catastrophic damage. The destroyer Steadfast had lost its entire portside, but kept firing its remaining weapons. The cruiser Defiance was venting atmosphere from 12 hull breaches, yet maintained formation with the fleet. These weren't tactical decisions. They were acts of desperation that violated every principle of strategic thinking. His aide, Sub-Commander Kithnal, approached with confusion radiating from his crystalline form. Overlord, the human fleet should have broken formation by now. Their casualties exceed acceptable parameters by 400%. Vexthar had studied human military history during the campaign preparation. Their wars were chaotic affairs, filled with emotional decisions that often cost more lives than necessary. They fought over abstract concepts like honor and freedom, ideas that couldn't be quantified or calculated. His strategists had dismissed human tactics as primitive and self-destructive, but watching the battle unfold, he began to see something his computers couldn't process. Captain Li Min-ho's destroyer, Dauntless, suddenly broke from the human formation, its engines blazing at maximum burn. Vexthar's tactical display immediately calculated the ship's trajectory. It was heading straight for the Dominion battlecruiser Eternal Dominance, one of their most powerful vessels. Warning the eternal dominance of incoming suicide attack, Kithnal reported. Their shields can easily absorb the impact. Vexthar watched as the human destroyer accelerated beyond safe parameters, its hull beginning to buckle from the stress. The ship's communications were broadcasting on all frequencies, and his translators picked up the transmission. Captain Li was speaking to his crew, not in the desperate tones of defeated soldiers, but with the calm certainty of people who had chosen their fate. "Engine room, give me everything you've got," Li's voice crackled through the static. "Helm, maintain. Course. All hands, it's been an honor serving with you." The Dauntless struck the battlecruiser's shields at full velocity and detonated its reactor core in a blinding flash. The explosion overwhelmed the enemy shields and tore a massive hole in the battlecruiser's hull. Atmosphere vented into space. As the great ship listed to starboard, its weapons offline, Vexthar stared at his displays in shock. The tactical computer was running diagnostic checks, unable to process what had just happened. The humans had sacrificed an entire ship and crew to damage one enemy vessel. By any rational calculation, it was a losing exchange. The Dominion had 300 ships. They could afford to lose one, but something had changed in the battle's rhythm. His other ship commanders were reporting unusual readings from their crews: uncertainty, doubt, emotions that had no place in Dominion warfare. "Overlord," Kithnal's voice carried undertones of concern. "The human fighters are launching from their remaining carriers. The carriers are heavily damaged and should be withdrawing to preserve their aircraft." Vexthar watched as swarms of small human fighters poured from crippled vessels that should have been fleeing the battlefield. These weren't strategic launches timed for maximum effectiveness. These were desperate releases of every available craft, regardless of tactical consideration. The fighters dove toward Dominion ships with reckless abandon, their pilots screaming battle cries that flooded the communication channels. "For Earth! Remember the colonies! They shall not pass!" The voices were young and old, male and female, all united in desperate fury. His species had encountered many forms of warfare across the galaxy. The Veltar fought with hive mind coordination. The Korathans used mathematical precision. The Xenari combined strategy with artistic grace. All of them followed logical patterns that could be predicted and countered, but these humans fought like something else entirely. They fought like cornered animals protecting their young, except they weren't cornered. They had chosen this fight knowing they couldn't win it. A new message appeared on his tactical display. Long-range sensors were detecting movement on the planet's surface. Small craft were rising from the colony, moving slowly and awkwardly. Evacuation shuttles. The humans weren't just fighting for military victory, they were buying time for something else entirely. Vexthar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold vacuum of space. His species had built their empire on the assumption that all intelligent life would choose survival over principle when faced with certain death. It was the foundation of Dominion strategy. Overwhelming force led to rational surrender. But these primitives weren't being rational. They were being human. As another wave of human fighters struck his ships, their pilots singing songs of home and sacrifice, Vexthar began to understand why the galaxy had never seen anything like this before. These creatures didn't fight because they believed they could win. They fought because they believed they had to, and that made them infinitely more dangerous than any enemy his mathematics could calculate. On worlds scattered across the galaxy, beings who had never met a human gathered around quantum displays, watching something that shouldn't have been possible. The battle for Kepler 442b was being broadcast live across coalition networks, and what started as a routine military briefing had become the most watched event in galactic history. In the crystal cities of Korathan Prime, geometric beings who thought only in numbers found themselves staring at displays with something approaching wonder. Their calculations had predicted human defeat within the first hour. That was 3 hours ago, and somehow the primitive mammals were still fighting. Prime Calculator XX901 floated before the main tactical display, his crystalline form shifting through mathematical configurations as he tried to process what he was seeing. The humans had now lost 9 of their 12 ships, yet they had managed something his species considered impossible. They were winning time. The evacuation shuttles rising from Kepler 442b moved with agonizing slowness, their civilian engines never designed for combat zones. Each shuttle carried 300 colonists, families huddled together as explosions lit up the sky above them. The human fleet was literally dying to protect these transports, trading warships for minutes, trading lives for hope. "This makes no mathematical sense," XX901 transmitted to his fellow calculators. "They are achieving negative strategic value while maintaining positive moral coefficient. The equation should not balance." But as he watched Commander Yun Da-un's fighter squadron dive into certain death to screen the rising transports, XX901 began to see a different kind of mathematics. Not the cold logic his species lived by, but something warmer. Something that calculated worth in ways his people had never considered. The Veltar Hive worlds buzzed with unprecedented activity. Queen Chikara felt the collective confusion of her trillion subjects as they processed the impossible human behavior through their shared consciousness. The Veltar had retreated from the battle because their hive mind had calculated the odds perfectly. Death was inevitable. Retreat was logical. But watching the humans fight, Chikara experienced something her species had never felt before. Individual, will overriding collective wisdom. The human pilots weren't sharing thoughts like her drones. Each one was making their own choice to die for strangers they'd never met. Fighter pilot Commander Yun Da-un's voice crackled through the communication channels as her squadron dove toward a cluster of Dominion interceptors. "Transport 7, you're clear for ascent. We've got your back." Chikara watched Yun's fighters engage enemies that outnumbered them 10 to 1. The human pilots flew with desperate skill, buying precious seconds for the civilian transport to clear the atmosphere. One by one the fighters were destroyed, but Transport 7 escaped with 300 colonist families aboard. As Yoon's own fighter disintegrated under enemy fire, Chikara felt something ripple through the hive mind. Her trillion subjects were experiencing individual emotion for the first time in their species' history. They felt loss for creatures they'd never met, admiration for sacrifice that defied all logic. "Cancel the retreat order," Chikara transmitted across her fleets. "We return to battle." The response from her ship commanders was immediate confusion. The tactical situation hadn't changed. The humans were still doomed. But something else had changed, something the Veltar collective was struggling to understand. They had learned to feel shame. On the artistic worlds of the Xenari Confederation, warrior poets gathered in great halls to witness what their finest minds were already calling the greatest epic in galactic history. The Xenari lived for stories of heroic struggle, but this was beyond even their most passionate imaginings. Master poet Kithavara composed verses in real time as the battle unfolded, her words flowing across Xenari networks like music made of starlight. See how the small ones stand against the dark, trading tomorrow for today, trading breath for hope. The Xenari had withdrawn from the battle to preserve their cultural superiority, but watching humans die for principles the Xenari only sang about. Their warrior hearts began to burn with something deeper than art. As Admiral Kim's flagship Terra's Resolve found itself surrounded by 50 Dominion warships, its shields failing and hull breached in dozen places, Xenari fleets began emerging from hyperspace. They came not as calculated military assistants, but as artists drawn to the greatest masterpiece of sacrifice the galaxy had ever seen. Down on Kepler 442b's surface, Private Choi Jun-seok crouched in the ruins of Spaceport 7, watching the final transport clear the atmosphere through his rifle scope. His position had been overrun an hour ago. His squad was dead. His ammunition was nearly gone. But the last 300 colonists were safe. Choi activated his suit's emergency beacon, but not for rescue. His fingers moved across the targeting system, painting coordinates for orbital bombardment. The spaceport had to be destroyed to prevent Dominion forces from using it to launch pursuit craft. "Fire mission. Grid reference 77 Alpha," he transmitted to the orbiting fleet. "Danger close. Repeat. Danger close." The response came immediately from Admiral Kim's flagship. "Confirmed 77 Alpha. You have 30 seconds to clear the area." Choi smiled and settled deeper into his position. "Negative, Command. I'm exactly where I need to be." The orbital bombardment turned the spaceport into a crater of molten glass. Choi's sacrifice ensured no pursuit would follow the escaping civilians. The final evacuation tally flickered across displays throughout Coalition space. 96% complete. 2,880 souls saved. 120 lost to the mathematics of war. But for the first time in galactic history, species across the Coalition were counting individual lives rather than statistical probabilities. The Veltar mourned specific humans they'd watched die. The Corathans calculated the infinite value of finite sacrifice. The Xenari composed names into eternal song. Humanity had taught the galaxy something profound and terrible, that some things were worth dying for, and that the courage to die for others was the most powerful force in the universe. As alien fleets converged on Kepler 442b, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore, the impossible battle entered its fourth hour. The mathematics still said the humans couldn't win, but mathematics had never accounted for the human heart. The impossible was happening across the star system as ships that had fled in logical retreat now returned with illogical purpose. What had started as humanity's lonely death stand was transforming into something the galaxy had never witnessed before. Multiple alien species choosing to die alongside humans for people they'd never met. Overlord Vexthar watched his tactical displays with growing horror as the neat, predictable battle dissolved into chaos. The Veltar Hive ships, which always moved in perfect geometric formations, were now swarming like angry insects around his battle cruisers. Their coordinated attacks had become wild, desperate charges that somehow proved more effective than their previous precision. Queen Chikara's voice echoed across Veltar communication networks. her usual calm replaced by something her species had never experienced before. Passionate fury. For the small ones who fight without hope. For the courage we never knew we lacked. Her drone pilots, who had spent their entire lives following hive mind calculations, were now making individual decisions in the heat of battle. They rammed Dominion fighters to protect human bombers. They shielded damaged human ships with their own hulls. They were learning to be individuals, and it was making them deadlier than they'd ever been as a collective. The Corathans were even more unsettling to watch. These crystalline beings lived by mathematical perfection, their every movement calculated, for optimal efficiency. But now they were abandoning their precise formations to throw themselves between Dominion weapons and crippled human vessels. Prime Calculator XX901's geometric ship form pulsed with colors that indicated severe computational stress. His kind had never acted against mathematical optimization before, but watching humans die for others had introduced a new variable into their equations, the infinite value of finite sacrifice. Protecting human vessel courage, XX901 transmitted, as he maneuvered his crystal ship to absorb a plasma barrage meant for the damaged human destroyer. Tactical value negative, moral coefficient immeasurable. His hull cracked under the enemy fire, rainbow light bleeding into space, but the human ship survived to fight another minute. For the first time in Corathan history, mathematics served emotion rather than the other way around. The Xenari arrival changed the entire character of the battle. Their ships moved like dancers through space, weaving between friend and foe with artistic grace. But instead of their traditional combat songs, they were fighting to human battle hymns broadcast from the crippled human fleet. Admiral Kim's voice cut through the chaos from her escape pod, somehow coordinating a dozen different species through a communication system cobbled together from salvaged parts. Her flagship Terra's resolve was gone, vaporized by Dominion heavy weapons, but her voice still carried the authority that had started this impossible stand. All units, this is Admiral Kim. Focus fire on Grid 7-7. We've got civilians rising from that sector. Her words reached Veltar drones, Corathan crystals, and Xenari warriors alike, and somehow they all understood not just her language, but her purpose. Lieutenant Park Soo-jin, floating in another escape pod nearby, managed to patch into the communication network. Admiral, we've lost contact with Evacuation Point 7. Dominion ground forces are closing on the last transport hub. Down on the planet's surface, the final drama was playing out in underground tunnels that had become humanity's last fortress. Sergeant Kim Tae-hyun crouched behind overturned mining equipment, his squad of 12 Marines holding off hundreds of Dominion assault troops. The tunnel system connected directly to the spaceport where the final civilian transports waited. His rifle overheated after the 15th Dominion soldier fell to his shots. Around him, his Marines fought with desperate efficiency, each knowing they were buying time measured in heartbeats. Private Yoon Mi-jin covered the left tunnel with a plasma cutter meant for mining equipment. Corporal Lee Dong-woo had turned maintenance charges into improvised grenades. "Sergeant, civilians are loading into the last transports," came the voice of the transport coordinator through his helmet comm. "We need another 10 minutes. Kim looked at his remaining ammunition, counted his surviving Marines, and calculated odds that would have made a Corathan weep. They had enough firepower for maybe 3 more minutes of defense. That's when he saw the proximity charges lining the tunnel walls, placed there during the colony's construction to allow emergency collapse in case of mining accidents. The charges could bring down the entire tunnel system, sealing off the spaceport from ground assault. "All Marines, fall back to position Bravo," Kim ordered. "I'm staying here." His soldiers understood immediately. They'd trained for this scenario, though none had ever believed they'd face it. One by one, they clasped Kim's shoulder and whispered quick farewells before falling back to the final defensive line. Kim's fingers found the detonator as Dominion soldiers poured around the corner, their energy weapons lighting up the tunnel, like deadly stars. He thought about his wife back on Earth, about the children in the transports above who would grow up free, because 12 humans chose to die in a hole in the ground. "This is Sergeant Kim Tae-hyun, final entry," he spoke into his helmet recorder. Tell my family I kept the promise. The explosion brought down half a mountain, sealing the tunnels forever and giving the transports their 10 minutes to escape. Above, in space, the impossible battle continued as species that had never fought together learned to die together. The Veltar taught themselves individual courage. The Corathans discovered that some mathematics could only be solved with hearts instead of processors. The Xenari found that the greatest art was not what you created but what you preserved. And through it all, human voices carried across the communication channels, holding the impossible alliance together with nothing but stubborn refusal to quit. They taught the galaxy something that couldn't be calculated or predicted, that hope was contagious, that courage could spread like wildfire, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply choosing to fight when everything said you should surrender. The evacuation count reached 98% complete. The mathematics still said they couldn't win, but mathematics had never met the human spirit, and now it was spreading to the stars. The great hall of the Dominion High Command stretched like a cathedral of black crystal, its walls carved with the names of conquered worlds. Overlord Vexthar floated in the center of the judgment sphere, his tentacles bound with energy restraints as 5 supreme overlords deliberated his fate. Behind him, holographic displays showed star maps painted in the red of rebellion. 47 systems that had been peaceful under Dominion rule for decades were now burning with revolt. Species that had surrendered without firing a shot were suddenly building weapons and singing human battle songs. The mathematical perfection of the Dominion war machine was cracking, and it had all started with one impossible battle above a mining colony that shouldn't have mattered. Supreme Overlord Kethran's voice boomed through the chamber like grinding stone. Explain to us, Vexthar, how 12 primitive vessels held off your entire fleet long enough for this infection to spread across our empire. Vexthar had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, reviewing every second of the battle, analyzing every decision. His tactical computers had run the scenario 1,000,000 times, and the conclusion was always the same. He should have won within the first hour. The humans fought beyond all rational parameters, he began, his voice steady despite the restraints. Our psychological profiles indicated they would surrender when faced with overwhelming odds. Every species in the galaxy follows this pattern. It is survival instinct. The displays around him showed footage from the battle, human ships ramming Dominion cruisers, fighters launching from crippled carriers, Marines detonating themselves to buy seconds for civilian transports. It was madness, by every military standard. The Dominion understood. But these creatures, Vexthar continued, they don't fight to survive, they fight because they believe they must. When we destroyed their ships, more species arrived to replace them. When we killed their soldiers, their allies learned to fight like humans. We were not facing 12 vessels, we were facing an idea. Supreme Overlord Nexavara's crystalline form pulsed with irritation. Ideas cannot destroy battle cruisers. Emotion cannot pierce our shields. No, Vexthar agreed, but they can make the impossible seem necessary. The humans taught other species that surrender is a choice, not an inevitability. Once that belief spreads, our entire strategy becomes useless. The sealed report he'd submitted to High Command contained his most disturbing conclusion. The Dominion had built their empire on a fundamental misunderstanding of galactic psychology. They assumed all intelligent life would choose survival over principle when faced with certain death. It was the bedrock of their military doctrine, but humanity had proven that assumption wrong, and worse, they'd taught others that it was wrong too. On New Geneva, 6 months later, Admiral Kim Jae-wook sat in a conference room overlooking the planet's capital city. Through the windows, she could see construction crews building new hospitals and schools, funded by grateful colonies across human space. The after-action reports from Kepler 442b covered the table in neat piles, each one telling the same story. From a different perspective. Coalition casualties, 300 dead. Civilian casualties, 120 dead, all from the initial orbital bombardment before the evacuation began. Total lives saved, 2,880. By any military standard, the operation had been tactically disastrous and strategically brilliant. Commander Park Si-jin, now wearing the insignia of a full captain, reviewed the cost assessments. "We lost 2/3 of our fleet, Admiral. Our best pilots are gone. 3 marine companies wiped out. From a resource perspective, it was incredibly expensive." Kim nodded, remembering the faces of the people who hadn't come home. Captain Lee, Minho, who'd rammed his destroyer into a Dominion battlecruiser. Commander Yoon Da-yoon, whose fighter squadron had died protecting civilian transports. Sergeant Kim Tae-hyun, who'd brought down a mountain to save strangers. But she also remembered the other numbers. The Veltar Queen Chikara had personally thanked her for teaching her species about individual courage. The Korathans had redesigned their entire fleet doctrine around human tactical principles. The Zanari were composing epic poems about the battle that would be sung for 1,000 years. Most importantly, the Dominion's expansion had stopped cold. Their perfect war machine couldn't handle enemies who fought harder when losing, who measured victory in lives saved rather than territory conquered. The cost was high, Kim said finally, watching a human transport dock at the orbital station above. Through the viewports, she could see alien passengers disembarking alongside human crew members, all working together with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to trust each other. "But look what we bought with it," Captain Park followed, her gaze. "A new kind of galaxy. A galaxy where surrender isn't automatic," Kim replied, "where species fight together instead of alone. Where someone's willingness to die for strangers isn't considered madness." The latest intelligence reports showed the effects spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Dominion client species were refusing tribute payments, demanding representation. In their own governance, even declaring independence despite hopeless odds. They'd learned humanity's most dangerous lesson, that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. "Would you do it again?" Park asked quietly. "Knowing what we know now, would you still give that order to hold the line?" Kim thought about the children who'd grown up on Kepler 442b, now attending schools on New Geneva. She thought about the Veltar drones who'd learned to think as individuals, the Korathan crystals who'd discovered the mathematics of sacrifice, the Zanari warriors who'd found that the greatest art was preserving life rather than creating beauty. She thought about Sergeant Kim Tae-hyun's last message, recorded in a tunnel as he prepared to die for people he'd never met. "Tell my family I kept the promise." "Without question," she answered. "That's what makes us human. The belief that some stands must be taken not because they can be won, but because they must not be lost." Outside the windows, human and alien children played together in the city parks, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. They were growing up in a galaxy where courage was contagious, where hope could spread from species to species like wildfire. The Dominion had learned too late that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their ships or their weapons. It was their stubborn refusal to accept that defeat was inevitable, and their ability to teach that refusal to others. The galaxy would never be the same.